Frank Sinatra worked with a lot of Hollywood stars during his career, but there was one man he never got over. What started as a casting decision on Guys and Dolls turned into a grudge that lasted for the rest of Sinatra's life. Even decades later, he still had nothing good to say about Marlon Brando. So what happened between them? To understand any of it, you have to go back before the sound stage, before the Oscar, before the screaming girls, and the collapse and the resurrection. You have to go back to a narrow street, in a rough river town, across the water from Manhattan, and to a woman who was small and loud and afraid of nothing, and to the night her only child arrived so violently that the doctor set him aside for dead. Frank Sinatra was born on the 12th of December in 1915 in a cold water flat on Monroe Street in Hoboken, New Jersey, and he nearly did not live to see the morning. He was a big baby, close to 13.5 pounds, and the delivery went badly. The doctor reached in with forceps and pulled hard, and the instrument tore the left side of the infant's face, his cheek, his neck, his ear, and punctured the eardrum. The baby came out blue and silent. The doctor, believing the child was gone, turned his attention to the mother, who was hemorrhaging and in danger herself. It was the grandmother who would not accept it. She snatched the limp baby, held him under the cold tap in the kitchen sink, and shocked him into his first breath. He screamed. He would go on screaming in one way or another for the rest of his life. He carried the marks of that night forever. The scars ran down the side of his face and neck, faint but there, the kind of thing a boy learns to hate in a mirror. The ruptured eardrum stayed with him too, and it would matter later, in ways no one could have guessed. But the deepest mark was not on his skin. It was the simple, unshakable knowledge, passed to him without a single word being spoken, that he had come into the world unwanted by fate itself, and had survived on nothing but somebody else's refusal to let him go. A man can build a whole personality on a fact like that. Sinatra did. He was an only child, which in an Italian immigrant neighborhood in those years was itself a kind of loneliness. The other flats were full of brothers and sisters and cousins spilling into the halls. Frank had no one. What he had instead was his mother, and his mother was enough to fill a house all by herself. Her name was Natalina, but everyone in Hoboken called her Dolly, and Dolly Sinatra was one of the most formidable people her son would ever meet, and he would meet presidents. She was small, blonde, blue-eyed, and utterly without fear. She worked as a midwife, delivering babies up and down the wards, and she was also, quietly and then not so quietly, a fixer in the local democratic machine, a woman who could turn out votes on election day and expect favors in return. She had a mouth like a longshoreman and a will like a bank vault. When she wanted something for her boy, doors opened, and if they did not open, she took them off the hinges. His father was the opposite of all that noise. Marty Sinatra had come from Sicily as a boy, and he was a quiet, almost silent man, illiterate, gentle, easily overrun. He had boxed for money as a young man under an Irish name, Marty O'Brien, because in that town in those years, an Italian could not always get the fight, and later he became a fireman. He loved his son in the wordless way of men who did not have word, but it was Dolly who ran the house, Dolly who set the temperature of every room, Dolly whose approval was the sun the whole family turned toward, and her approval was a difficult thing to earn and an easy thing to lose. She adored the boy, and she was hard on him in the same breath, and that combination does something particular to a child. She dressed him better than the other kids on the block, so well that the neighborhood boys mocked and called him a little lord in his fancy clothes. And he learned early that standing out could get you loved and get you hit, sometimes on the same afternoon. She had a temper that could turn in a second, and when it turned, she could be cruel. And then just as fast she could fold him into her arm and make him feel like the only creature on earth that mattered. He never knew which mother he was going to get, so he spent his whole childhood watching a face for the smallest change of weather, learning to read a room the way other children learn to read a book. It made him charming. It made him watchful. It made him terrified of being left, and just as terrified of being ordinary, because ordinary was the one thing Dolly could not abide. Here is the wound in its simplest form, and everything that came later grew out of it. Dolly wanted her son to be somebody, and she let him know, without ever quite saying it, that as he was not yet enough. Not enough to escape the scars, not enough to escape Hoboken, not enough yet. The word yet is the cruelest part. It keeps a boy running his whole life toward a finish line that keeps moving. And it teaches him that love is a prize you win by performing, never a gift you simply receive. Sinatra would chase that prize through every marriage, every hit record, every sold-out room, every Oscar. And it would never quite fill the hole, because the hole was cut before he could talk. Hoboken in those years was a hard, crowded, working town of docks and rail yards, and immigrant families stacked 3 deep, a place where a boy learned quickly who had power and who did not, and where softness was a thing you hid. Frank grew up in it as a curious kind of outsider, inside his own neighborhood. He was the only child in a world of big families. He was the well-dressed boy in a world of hand-me-downs, because Dolly saw to it that her son wore the good coat and the clean shirt, and the other kids made him pay for it in the street. He was the scarred one, the boy with the marked cheek and the bad ear, sensitive about both in the way that only a child can be, learning to angle his face and cover the damage before he understood why it mattered. All of that could have crushed him, and in another boy it might have. In Frank, it did something else. It sharpened him. The child who got picked on learned to talk his way out of a beating, or to land the first punch and mean it, and both skills would show up in the man. The child in the fine clothes learned to like standing out, to need it, to feel that being looked at was the closest thing to being safe. And the child with the marked face learned to make people forget the marks, to charm so hard and sing so sweet that no one would think to look at the scar. He was building the machinery of Frank Sinatra out of the raw material of a bullet Hoboken kid, and every piece of it was a defense against the same fear, that if he stopped performing for even a moment, they would see the boy the doctor had set aside for dead. He was a poor student and a worse fit for school, and he left it early, without much of a diploma, and drifted through the odd jobs a Hoboken kid could get, loading trucks, working the docks, catching rivets at a shipyard. None of it held him. What held him was a voice coming out of a radio. It belonged to Bing Crosby, and the effect on the young Sinatra was total. Crosby did not sing the way the old belters sang, straining to reach the back of a theater. He crooned. He sang into the new microphones as if he were murmuring to one person in a quiet room, intimate, easy, warm, to a lonely boy who had spent his childhood reading faces. That intimacy was a revelation. Here was a way to walk into a room full of strangers and make every single one of them feel that you were singing to them alone. Sinatra saw Crosby perform in Jersey City in the early 1930s, and he came home and told his mother he was going to be a singer. Dolly was not thrilled. Singers were not respectable, and respectability mattered to a woman clawing her family up out of the immigrant working class. But she was also a realist, and when she saw the boy would not be moved, she did what she always did. She threw her weight behind him. She bought him a portable public address system, a microphone and small speakers of his own, worth a good deal of money in those years. And that gear made him valuable to the local bands, because he came with his own equipment. She leaned on her contacts to get him bookings. The same force that had pushed him and shamed him now pushed him forward. And the boy who had spent his life auditioning for his mother's love simply widened the audition to include the world. He had almost nothing going for him but the want. His voice, in the beginning, was thin and untrained. He could not read music and never would. He was skinny to the point of frail, with those ears that stuck out and those scars along his jaw. Not a matinee face, not yet. What he had was an appetite for it that frightened people, and an ear, and a stubbornness he had inherited straight from Dolly. He would listen to a record until he had swallowed it whole. He studied the way sound moved through a room. He worked on the one instrument he owned, his own breath, with the seriousness of a man polishing a diamond. In 1935, he joined 3 other local boys and called the group the Hoboken Four, and they went on Major Bowes and the original Amateur Hour, the radio talent show. That was the closest thing that era had to a national stage, and they won. It was the first proof, broadcast to the whole country, that the want might actually be worth something. It did not make him a star. It made him hungry in a new and more dangerous way, because now he had tasted it. He sang for meals at a New Jersey roadhouse called the Rustic Cabin, a singing waiter really, taking requests and hustling for tips. And he made sure the radio wire that ran out of the place carried his voice a little further than the room. He was building himself in public, one small chance at a time, and he was ferocious about every one of them. Then in 1939, a trumpet player named Harry James, who had just left Benny Goodman to start his own band, heard the skinny kid on the radio wire and hired him. For the first time, Sinatra had a real job with a real band. And for the first time, his name went up outside a theater. James wanted to change it, thought Sinatra was too ethnic, too much of a mouthful, suggested he call himself Frankie Satin. Sinatra refused flat. The name was Sinatra, his father's name, Dolly's name, Hoboken's name, and he was not going to sand it down to please anyone. It is a small moment and an enormous one. The insecure boy who would spend his life terrified of not being enough had one thing he would not trade for success, and it was the truth of where he came from. He would betray a great many things in his life. He never once betrayed that. The next step changed everything, and it came at the end of 1939, when Sinatra jumped from Harry James to Tommy Dorsey, the most successful band leader in the country. James let him go with a handshake and no hard feelings, which Sinatra never forgot, and the young singer stepped onto the biggest stage in American popular music. Dorsey was a hard, driving boss, a man who ran his orchestra like a general and paid himself first, and he became something like a second father to Sinatra, which is to say a man whose approval the boy craved and whose control he came to resent. What Sinatra took from Dorsey was not a fatherly warmth. It was a technique, and it was the making of him. Dorsey played the trombone, and he had a way of holding a musical line so long and so smoothly that you could not hear him breathe. The phrase would go on, seamless, unbroken, and the young singer standing a few feet away became obsessed with the mystery of it. Where was the man taking his breath? Sinatra watched him for weeks, studying the small movements, and finally worked out that Dorsey was sneaking air through the corner of his mouth in tiny, hidden sips, so that the sound never stopped. Sinatra decided he would learn to do the same thing with his voice. So he trained like an athlete. He swam laps underwater to build his lungs. He ran. He held single notes until his face went red, then held them longer. He learned to carry a lyric across a long, curving line without an audible breath, so that the words seemed to float on one continuous stream of feeling, the sentence and the emotion arriving together and never breaking apart. That is the secret of the thing people would spend decades trying to describe. Sinatra did not just hit the notes. He phrased a song the way a great actor reads a speech, letting the meaning bend the melody, making a familiar lyric sound like a private confession spoken to you alone. The lonely boy who had learned to read faces had grown into a man who could make a whole nation feel understood. He built that gift note by note in the back of a band bus, and it belonged to him more completely than anything else he would ever own. Understand what the voice was to him, because it is the whole key to why the coming insult would cut where nothing else could. Everything else in Sinatra's life had been given by others and could be taken by others. The fame came from the crowds, and the crowds were fickle. The looks came from a face that had been scarred at birth. The money came and went with the fashions, but the voice was his. He had built it himself in the dark, out of his own breath and his own stubbornness, note by note in the back of a bus, and no studio boss and no columnist, and no rival could reach inside his throat and take it away. It was the one wall Hoboken had not built and could not breach, the one place the old verdict could not follow him. When he sang, he was not the scarred kid, not the runt, not the boy set aside for dead. He was, briefly and completely, enough. So a role that turned on singing was not just a role to him. It was a claim staked on the only ground he truly owned. And to lose that ground to a man who could not sing at all was not a professional setback. It was a trespass on the one sacred thing, and he would treat it like one for the rest of his days. By the early 1940s, the girls had started to notice. Not just to notice, to scream. Sinatra left Dorsey at the end of 1942 in a split that was ugly and expensive. Dorsey had signed the young singer to a punishing personal contract that took a large slice of his earnings for years to come, and he had no wish to let go of the goose laying such golden eggs. How Sinatra got free became one of the enduring legends of his life. The clean version is that lawyers and money settled it. The other version, the one that followed him forever and that he always denied, held that certain persuasive friends paid Dorsey a visit and made him an offer built around a contract, and in the most colorful tellings, the wrong end of a gun, and that the bandleader signed the release for $1 and never spoke warmly of Sinatra again. Whatever the truth, and the truth is almost certainly more paperwork than pistol, the story stuck because it fit the shadow already gathering around him, and because a poisoned version of it would one day be thrown back in his face in a way that cut deeper than any headline. He went out on his own, and what happened next had never quite happened to a singer before. When he appeared at the Paramount Theater in New York, the young women in the audience did something new. They shrieked, they wept, they fainted, they threw things. They called out his name as though he could hear them, and only them. The Bobby Soxers, the press called them, teenage girls in their rolled-down socks, and they turned a slight, scarred kid from Hoboken into the first modern pop idol, the template for every screaming crowd that would ever follow. The peak of it came in the autumn of 1944, again at the Paramount, in what the newspapers called the Columbus Day Riot. Thousands of girls lined up around the block. The theater held a few thousand and refused to empty between shows, so the ones already inside would not leave, and the crowd outside swelled into the tens of thousands and spilled into Times Square and stopped traffic and broke windows and overwhelmed the police. All of it for a man singing love songs into a microphone. He had found the exact thing Crosby had shown him years earlier, the trick of singing to one person in a room, and he had aimed it at a generation of lonely girls whose sweethearts were overseas at war, and it landed like nothing before it. That war shadowed his triumph, and it planted another grievance in a man who was already a garden of them. Sinatra did not serve. When he went for his physical, the doctors classified him 4F, unfit, largely because of that punctured eardrum from the night he was born, the same violence that had scarred his face, now keeping him out of uniform. Whatever the medical truth, and there were whispers of other reasons, of emotional instability noted in the file, of strings pulled, the optics were terrible. Millions of young men were dying in the Pacific and in Europe, while this crooner stayed home and made teenage girls faint. The resentment was loud and public. He was called a slacker, a draft dodger worse. Columnists sharpened their knives, and Sinatra, who felt every slight as a wound, absorbed all of it and stored it away. Another reason to believe that the world was watching for him to fail. Another reason to prove them wrong. Even at the top, he never felt safe. That was the pattern of his whole life. The higher he climbed, the more certain he became that the fall was already scheduled. He had married by then a Hoboken girl named Nancy Barbato in 1939, and they had 3 children, Nancy and Frank Jr. and Tina. And on paper, he was a family man at the summit of American music. In truth, he was restless, unfaithful, driven, and already showing the temper that would define him as much as the voice did. The same volatility he had learned watching Dolly's face change now belonged to him. The sudden warmth and the sudden ice. The loyalty that could turn to fury in a heartbeat and back again. Friends learned to read him the way he had once read his mother. You never quite knew which Frank was coming through the door. For a few years in the mid-1940s, he was untouchable, the highest paid entertainer in the country, a radio star, a movie contract at MGM sold out theaters, a mansion in the hills. The scarred boy had outrun Hoboken. The forceps and the cold tap and the fancy clothes and the taunts, all of it left behind. And then, almost as suddenly as it had come, the whole thing began to fall apart. And Frank Sinatra, who had spent his life dreading the fall, got to live it in front of the entire world. The fall did not come all at once. It came the way most falls do, in a slow accumulation of losses that only look inevitable afterward. The screaming girls grew up and moved on. A new sound was coming into fashion, and the crooner who had defined the war years began to seem, to the fickle machinery of show business, like yesterday. His records stopped selling the way they had. The films MGM put him in were thin and forgettable, and the studio that had signed him with such fanfare cooled toward him. The press, which had built him up, discovered how much fun it was to tear him down, and it went at the work with real appetite, feeding on his temper, his politics, his rumored friendships with men whose names turned up in newspapers for the wrong reasons. Then his voice failed him. It happened on stage at the Copacabana in New York in the spring of 1950, in front of a room full of people who had paid to see the great Sinatra. He opened his mouth to sing, and almost nothing came out. His vocal cords had hemorrhaged. For a man whose entire identity, whose whole escape from Hoboken, whose one unassailable proof that he was enough, lived in his throat, it was the nightmare made real. The one thing they could never take from him had been taken by his own body. He had to cancel, and rest, and wait, and wonder in the silence whether it would ever come back. There is no evidence to guess at the fear of those weeks. There is only the fact that a man who had built a cathedral of talent to hide a childhood wound had watched the walls start to crack. While his career burned, his heart was somewhere it had no business being. He had fallen for Ava Gardner, one of the most beautiful women in the world, and one of the most volatile, and the affair was open and scandalous, and destroyed his marriage to Nancy. The public, and this was still an era when the public cared about such things, turned on him hard. He was a family man carrying on with a movie star. Catholic America was appalled. He left Nancy and the children, married Ava at the end of 1951, and stepped into a relationship that was as combustible as a struck match. They loved each other, and they could not live with each other. Their fights were operatic, screaming and thrown objects and doors that came off hinges. Two proud, jealous, wounded people, setting fire to the very thing they could not bear to lose. Ava was the one woman who would not be managed, who gave as good as she got, who refused to worship him, and that made her the great obsession and the great torment of his life. She was, in a way, the one person who could do to him what the world had done, wound him exactly where he was weakest. And she did it not out of cruelty, but simply by being unownable. Sinatra could command a room, a record label, a crowd of thousands. He could not command Ava Gardner. She had her own fame, her own beauty, her own appetites, and her own flat refusal to make herself small, so that his pride could feel large. When she looked at other men, or was rumored to, his jealousy went past anger into something like panic, because losing her would confirm that even at his most magnetic, he was not enough to hold the one thing he wanted most. They would part and come back and part again, a cycle of separations and reunions that ran on for years, and each break tore at the same old fear. He made some of the loneliest, most beautiful records of his life in the middle of that heartbreak, pouring the ache straight into the microphone, which is the strange mercy given to a wounded artist, that the very thing tearing his life apart becomes the thing that deepens his work. The saloon songs of his great years are, in part, letters to Ava he could not bring himself to send. Hold that, because the marriage was not a closed chapter. By the time the trouble with Brando began, it was live and bleeding through those very same years. When Sinatra clawed his way back with From Here to Eternity, Ava was part of the story, quietly working a door or two on his behalf, even as the two of them were coming apart at the seams. And when he walked onto the Guys and Dolls set, raw and proud and freshly returned from the dead, his marriage to the one woman who could unmake him was falling to pieces in the background, another loss circling, another wound half open. A man in that condition does not need much of a reason to hate. He is already carrying more feeling than he can hold. Everything went at once. MGM let him out of his contract. His record label, Columbia, dropped him after the hits dried up. His radio show ended. Even his talent agency, the powerful MCA, cut him loose. And there is no lower feeling in Hollywood than the one that comes when the agents who once fought over you stop returning your calls. He was, by the start of 1952, close to finished. Broke or close to it, ridiculed, a punchline. The idol of a generation, reduced to a has-been in his middle 30s, which in show business is the cruelest age to fail. Old enough to be past your moment, and young enough to have decades left to remember it. Imagine the isolation of it. He had spent his whole life running from the fear that he was not enough, and here was the world confirming it in headlines. The Bobby Soxers who had screamed his name were married now with children of their own, and they did not scream for anyone. The men who had shaken his hand at the top looked through him at parties. He would go into a nightclub and hear the murmur move across the room. That used to be Sinatra. Look at him now. For a man who read every room like a threat, every one of those rooms was now a small execution. He drank, he raged. By some accounts, he came close to ending it, in the low way that despair works on a proud man who who has run out of runway. And here is the thing to hold on to, because it explains everything that comes after. Frank Sinatra did not fall from a comfortable height into a soft place. He fell all the way to the floor, and he lay there long enough to feel it in his bones. The fear, the shame, the certainty that the world had finally caught him being ordinary. He got a good long look at the bottom. Most people who reach that place stay there. When Sinatra came back, he came back with the floor still under his fingernails, and he never once forgot the feeling of it, and he never again believed for a single day that his success was safe. A man who has been that low does not lose gracefully. He cannot. He has already seen where the road leads. The particular humiliations of those years were the kind that lodge under the skin. There was the night he sang to a nearly empty house, where a few thousand had once screamed his name. There were the sneering items in the columns, the professional needlers who had helped build him, now competing to write the sharpest line about his fall. There was the plain arithmetic of it, the bookings drying up, the money going, the telephone that used to ring itself off the hook gone silent for days at a stretch. For most men, a slow decline is a private grief. For Sinatra, it was a public trial, reported in the same papers his fans read over breakfast, and every notice of his collapse was a fresh confirmation of the oldest thing he knew about himself, that he was one bad season away from being nobody again. He had escaped Hoboken, and here was Hoboken reaching back up to pull him down. What that season did to him permanently was kill the possibility of ease. A man who has been all the way down and come back does not walk through the world like a man who has only ever won. He walks through it braced. Every good thing feels borrowed. Every rival looks like the one who will finally take it all back. And every insult, however small, however petty, lands on a nerve that never fully heals, because it whispers the thing the whole world once said out loud. That is the Frank Sinatra who would one day walk onto the set of Guys and Dolls. Not a spoiled star, a survivor who had learned in the worst way there is, that the fall was always real and always waiting, and who had decided he would never again let anyone push him toward the edge without a fight. The rope out of the pit was a book, and then a roll, and then the fight of his life to get it. The book was From Here to Eternity, James Jones's big novel of Army life in Hawaii, on the eve of Pearl Harbor, and Columbia Pictures was making it into a major film, and in it was a character named Angelo Maggio, a skinny, scrappy, doomed Italian soldier who mouths off to the wrong men and pays for it with his life. Sinatra read it and knew, with the certainty of a man recognizing his own reflection, that Maggio was him, not the Sinatra of the tuxedo and the microphone, the other one, the Hoboken kid, the runt with the big mouth and the bigger heart, who would not back down no matter how badly he was outmatched. He had lived that character. He simply had to be allowed to play it. The trouble was that no one wanted him. He was box office poison, a fallen star with a reputation for temper, and the head of Columbia, Harry Cohn, one of the roughest and most feared moguls in the business, could not see why he should hand a serious dramatic role to a washed-up crooner. There were other actors in line, established, bankable, safe. Sinatra did something he had never done for anyone. He begged. He wrote to Cohn. He telephoned. He flew himself back from Africa where Ava was filming. He offered to play Maggio for almost nothing, a few $1,000s when he had once commanded a fortune. And by some accounts, Ava herself quietly worked on Cohn's wife to soften the studio from the inside. He wanted the part the way a drowning man wants air. He screen tested for it, which a star of his former rank would have considered a humiliation. And he was electric, because he was not acting, he was remembering. Cohn gave him the role for a reported $8,000, a fraction of what he had once earned in a week. And Sinatra did not care about the money. He was not buying a paycheck. He was buying his way back to being enough. How he finally got that part is itself a piece of Hollywood legend. And the legend is worth telling with care, because a version of it would come back to haunt both men 20 years later. The head of Columbia, Harry Cohn, was a hard man who had little use for a faded crooner. And by the accounts that have come down, Sinatra had to beg for the screen test. And Ava, still loving him even as their marriage came apart, worked quietly behind the scenes to press his case. That much stands on reasonably solid ground. What does not stand? What has never been proven and probably never can be is the darker rumor that trailed the casting for the rest of his life. The whisper that certain friends of his from the wrong side of things had leaned on Cohn to give the boy his chance. There is no evidence it happened. Cohn had plenty of practical reasons of his own, but the whisper stuck, the way whispers do when a man keeps the company Sinatra kept. And years later, a novelist would take that very rumor, a fading singer, a studio boss, a role that meant everything, and turn it into one of the most famous scenes in the history of American film. Keep that in your pocket, it comes back. The shoot itself became a kind of penance and a kind of prayer. Sinatra worked in Hawaii for a fraction of his old fee, on a picture where he was the smallest of the leads, and he treated it like the last chance it was. There was one scene above all that he had to get right: the death of Maggio, the little soldier, finally broken by the beatings of a cruel stockade sergeant, crawling back to his friends, only to die in the arms of the man who loved him. Sinatra did not have to reach far for it. He had the whole of his own recent dying to draw on. The 2 years of being counted out, the long humiliation, the sense of a small, brave man taking punishment he did not deserve. When the camera rolled, he gave them something raw and true. And the crew, who had signed on expecting a faded crooner slumming in a serious picture, went quiet. They were watching a man act out his own resurrection while it was still happening. He was extraordinary in the film. Maggio's death scene, the small, brave, doomed soldier beaten to death by a sadistic sergeant, landed on audiences with a force no one had expected from the fallen idol. And on Oscar night, in the spring of 1954, Frank Sinatra won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, and the room rose for him. And the man who had spent 2 years listening to a whole industry write his obituary walked to the stage and took the statuette in his hands. It was the greatest comeback American show business had ever seen. He had gone to the bottom all the way and clawed his way back up with his fingernails. And now he had the trophy to prove he had done it. And then, by his own telling, something happened that night that says more about the man than the win itself ever could. The party scattered, the way parties do, and Sinatra found himself out on the street, alone in the small hours, holding the most coveted object in his business in his 2 hands, with no one beside him to hold it up for. So he walked. He wandered the quiet streets of Beverly Hills by himself, past the dark houses of people who had crossed the street to avoid him a year earlier, carrying his Oscar like a man carrying a lantern. And a policeman, the story goes, recognized him and let him be. Think about that picture. The single greatest night of his professional life, the summit of the greatest comeback the town had ever seen, and he spent the end of it walking alone in the dark. A vindicated man goes home to a full house. A reprieved man walks the streets at 3 in the morning, half afraid that if he goes to sleep, he will wake up and find the whole thing was a dream, and the fall is still waiting for him where he left it. He had the trophy. He did not yet have the safety. He would never entirely have the safety. That was the wound talking, the old Hoboken arithmetic, whispering that no prize is ever the last word, that you are only ever as good as the next thing you have to prove. But hold that image, because it matters for everything that follows. Most men who win at that moment feel vindicated. Sinatra felt reprieved. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference. A vindicated man believes he has finally proven what he always was. A reprieved man knows how close he came to the end, and cannot stop looking over his shoulder. Sinatra had the Oscar, and the renewed contracts, and the return of the crowds, and underneath all of it, he carried the memory of the floor, the certainty that fortune was a thief who could come back in the night. He had won everything and trusted none of it. So when a threat appeared, real or imagined, he did not weigh it calmly. He went at it like a man, defending the last dry ground above the flood. And a threat had already appeared, though he had not yet had the chance to hate it up close. His name was Marlon Brando, and to understand why he got so far under Sinatra's skin, you have to leave Hoboken for a while and travel out to the flat gray plains of the American Midwest, to another lonely, watchful child raised by a mother who could not be relied upon, a boy who would grow up to become everything Sinatra was not, and to take, twice, the very roles Sinatra believed were his. Marlon Brando was born in Omaha, Nebraska, in the spring of 1924, which made him 9 years younger than Sinatra, a gap that mattered enormously, because Brando arrived as the face of the future exactly at the moment Sinatra was fighting to prove he was not the past. On the surface, the two men could not have been more different. Sinatra was the sharp-dressed Italian kid from a river town, all polish and precision and controlled charm. Brando was a rangy, mumbling, restless Midwesterner who looked as though he had slept in his clothes and did not care what you thought about it. But dig beneath the surface, and you find the same fault line running through both childhoods. A mother at the center of everything, and a home a boy could never quite trust. Brando's mother was named Dorothy, and everyone called her Dodie, and she was, by every account, a warm, artistic, unconventional woman who loved her son deeply and drank herself into oblivion with a regularity that shaped his entire inner life. She had been a gifted amateur actress in Omaha, had even shared a stage in her younger days with an unknown Henry Fonda, and she carried the ache of a talent that never got its chance. His father, Marlon Sr., was a stern, cold, domineering traveling salesman who belittled the boy and could not see anything in him worth encouraging. So here is the strange, sad mirror. Sinatra had a mother who was too strong, a force who pushed and shamed and drove him. Brando had a mother who was too weak, a sweetness that kept dissolving into the bottle and leaving him alone. One boy learned that love had to be earned through relentless performance. The other learned that love, even when it was real, could not be counted on to stay in the room. Both boys grew up hungry, watchful, and wounded, and both poured that hunger into being watched. They were, in the deepest way, two answers to the same terrible question. That is often how it goes with men who cannot stand each other. They are not opposites, they are too much alike. And there is a final cruelty in the likeness, which is that each man became famous for the exact thing the other one lacked and longed for. Brando had a face and a presence that needed no polish, a raw natural gift that fell on him like weather, and he spent his life half ashamed of it, wishing it meant less. Sinatra had to manufacture his gift out of nothing but breath and will, and he treasured it precisely because it had cost him everything, and he could never understand a man who would treat such a gift so carelessly. Each looked at the other and saw a kind of blasphemy. To Sinatra, Brando was a man throwing away treasure. To Brando, Sinatra was a man worshiping a trinket. They were both wrong, and they were both right, and they never once found the words to tell each other so. That is the thing about two men who are too much alike. They mistake the reflection for a rival, and they spend their lives fighting the one person who might have understood them. Brando ran off toward the thing that would save him, the same way Sinatra had run toward the microphone. For Brando, the thing was acting, and he found it in New York, where a great teacher named Stella Adler took the raw, undisciplined, achingly sensitive boy and gave him a way to turn all that private pain into something an audience could not look away from. What Adler taught, and what a whole generation of young actors around the group theater and later the Actors Studio was chasing, was a new kind of truth on the stage. Not the grand, clear, beautifully spoken performances of the older tradition, where an actor stood tall and delivered his lines like polished silver. Something rawer, an actor who seemed to be discovering the words as he spoke them, who scratched and paused and mumbled and looked away, who behaved less like a performer and more like a real, unguarded human being caught in a private moment. It was messy on purpose. It felt dangerously alive. Brando became the greatest of them almost overnight, and the role that announced it was Stanley Kowalski in Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire, first on Broadway in the late 1940s, and then, in 1951 on film. He came onto the screen in a torn t-shirt, sweating, animal, magnetic, and he did not seem to be acting at all, which was of course the whole point and the highest art. Audiences had never seen anything like it. A young man in the seats watched Brando and thought, so that is what a man can be. And an older actor or an older singer watching the same performance felt something colder move through him, the suspicion that the ground had just shifted, that the rules he had mastered were quietly being repealed. Brando had learned his craft from Stella Adler, one of the great teachers of the new American acting, who trained her students to build a character from the inside out, from memory and imagination, and the raw material of their own lives, rather than reciting pretty lines and hitting a chalk mark. It was a different religion of acting, and Brando was its first great convert and its first great proof when he came to Broadway as Stanley Kowalski. In Tennessee Williams's play about a fragile woman and the brutal brother-in-law who breaks her, audiences had seen nothing like it. He did not perform the part. He seemed to be living it, sweating and mumbling and erupting, dangerous and tender in the same breath, so real that people forgot they were watching a play. When he carried Kowalski to the screen a few years later, the whole idea of what a film actor could be shifted under everyone's feet, Sinatra's included. This was the man who would be handed Sky Masterson. This was the gift Sinatra was up against. This is the piece that people miss when they treat the feud as a simple clash of two big egos. Brando did not just take a role Sinatra wanted. Brando was the living proof that Sinatra's entire world was passing. Sinatra came out of the studio system, out of the discipline of the great bands, out of an age that prized polish, control, precision. The professional who hit his mark and nailed his lyric and made it all look effortless. Every ounce of that was hard-won, built brick by brick over a childhood of performing for a mother's love. And now here came a mumbling kid from Omaha who threw all of it away and got worshipped for the throwing, who made polish itself look phony, who made effortless charm seem like a lie people told before the war. To a man as insecure as Sinatra, that was not a rival, that was a verdict. Brando was the future telling Sinatra to his face that he was already old-fashioned, and Sinatra had just crawled up out of a hole in the ground for the crime of seeming old-fashioned. He was in no mood to hear it again. The first real theft happened before they ever met, and it happened over a film that would become one of the most celebrated in American history. In the early 1950s, the director Elia Kazan was preparing On the Waterfront, the story of Terry Malley, a washed-up boxer and dock worker who finds his conscience and stands up to the mob that owns him. It was a great role, maybe the greatest of that decade, a man who has thrown away his own promise and gets one last chance to matter. And for a stretch of the development before Brando committed, Kazan and the producer looked hard at Frank Sinatra for the part. You can see why the idea made sense. And you can see why it lodged in Sinatra like a splinter that never came out. Terry Malley was a Hoboken kind of a man, working class, Catholic, scrappy, a fighter who could have been somebody. The film was even going to shoot on the Hoboken waterfront, on Sinatra's own home ground, along the docks where his father had lived and his people had worked. It was, in a real sense, his story set on his streets. He wanted it. By some accounts, he believed for a while that it was his, that a deal was as good as done. And then Brando, who had wavered and hesitated in his moody way, said yes after all. And Kazan, who had directed Brando to greatness in Streetcar, took the bigger star, and that was that. Terry Malley, the ex-fighter who could have been a contender on the Hoboken docks, went to the kid from Omaha. Brando gave the performance of a lifetime. The famous scene in the back of the taxi, the quiet, broken "I could have been a contender," became one of the most beloved moments in the history of the movies. And it won Marlon Brando the Academy Award for Best Actor for 1954. So now line up the calendar and feel what Sinatra felt. He wins his Oscar for Maggio in the spring of 1954. The comeback complete, and almost in the same breath Brando wins the biggest prize in acting for playing a Hoboken fighter in a role Sinatra had believed was his. Shot on Sinatra's own waterfront, the two triumphs were tangled together from the start. Every time Sinatra looked at his own miracle, there was Brando standing next to it, holding a bigger one, having taken it from Frank's own backyard. Line the two Oscar nights up side by side, and you can watch a whole era turn on its hinge. In the spring of 1954, Frank Sinatra stood at the podium clutching the award for Maggio, the most improbable comeback the town had ever produced. A dead man walking back into the light. He had climbed out of the grave for that statue. And barely a year later, in the spring of 1955, the town gathered again and handed the biggest prize of all, Best Actor, to Marlon Brando for the broken dock worker on the Hoboken waterfront, the role Sinatra had wanted and briefly believed was his. Sinatra's miracle had lasted almost exactly 12 months before the younger man arrived to stand a step higher on the same stage. The industry, watching, understood what it was seeing. The old kind of stardom was taking its bow, gracious and grateful, and the new kind was walking up to accept the future. Sinatra understood it too. He had every reason to. He was the one whose backyard the future kept borrowing. It would have been enough to sour any man. But fate, or Hollywood, which sometimes amounts to the same thing, was not finished arranging the collision, because at that exact moment, a producer named Samuel Goldwyn was assembling the most expensive musical of his career, and there was a role in it that seemed to have been written with Frank Sinatra's voice in mind. And Goldwyn was about to give it to the one actor in America who could not sing. Guys and Dolls had been the toast of Broadway since 1950, a musical about gamblers and missionaries and showgirls on the wrong side of Times Square, with songs by Frank Loesser, so good they had become standards before the show even closed. Every studio in town wanted the film rights, and Goldwyn, a legend of old Hollywood who liked to spend big and win, paid a reported $1 million for them, a record price in those days. The kind of number that told the whole industry he intended to make an event. When you spend $1 million on a property, you do not cast it with stage actors and hope. You cast it with the biggest names money can buy. It helps to understand what a picture like this meant in that particular year. Because the stakes were larger than one musical, Hollywood was frightened. Television had arrived in America's living rooms and was pulling the audience out of the movie houses night after night. And the old studio system that had run the town like a cluster of little kingdoms was beginning to crack. The answer the studios reached for was bigness, the kind of size the small screen could not match. Wide color spectacles and lavish musicals, with stars whose names alone could fill a theater. Guys and Dolls was exactly that sort of bet. A huge, expensive gamble that the movies could still do something television could not. So the pressure on it was enormous, and the pressure fell hardest on the two men at its center, who were expected to carry a small fortune of other people's money on the strength of their fame. It was not a comfortable place to put two proud, anxious, competitive men who could not stand the sight of each other. It was a pressure cooker with the lid bolted on. The role that mattered most was Sky Masterson, the elegant high-stakes gambler who will bet on anything, who falls for a mission doll, and sings the show's two greatest numbers, the aching "I've never been in love before" and the soaring "Prayerful luck be a lady." It is a singer's dream, a role that lives or dies on charm and voice, and half of Hollywood was considered for it. Gene Kelly wanted it and would have been perfect, but his home studio would not lend him out. Names like Burt Lancaster and Robert Mitchum, and even Bing Crosby got floated around. And Frank Sinatra, fresh off his Oscar, his voice fully restored, at the absolute peak of his powers as a singer, wanted Sky Masterson more than he wanted almost anything, and he lobbied for it hard. Think about how right it was. Here was a role built on exactly the gift Sinatra had spent his whole life perfecting, the ability to take a song like "Luck Be a Lady" and bend it and phrase it, and make a whole theater lean forward. He would later prove the point in the most emphatic way possible, by taking that very song into his stage act and singing it for the rest of his life, until it became one of the numbers people most associated with him. Sky Masterson was his by every measure of talent that could be named. It fit him the way Maggio had fit him. He could feel it. Goldwyn gave it to Marlon Brando. The logic was pure box office, and in its own cold way it was sound. Brando was, at that moment, the single biggest draw in American movies, fresh off the Oscar, the name that guaranteed a full house. Goldwyn wanted the era's most powerful star on his marquee, and he was willing to overlook the small technical detail that his most powerful star had never sung a note in his life, and was terrified of the whole idea. Brando himself was reluctant, worried he would embarrass himself, and by some accounts agreed only because he was allowed to believe his singing might be dubbed by a professional, which in the end it was not. There is even a widely repeated story, impossible to fully confirm, that Cary Grant nudged Brando to take the part, partly for the pleasure of getting under Sinatra's skin. Whether or not Grant ever said it, the effect was the same. The singing role went to the man who could not sing, chosen precisely because he was the star. Sinatra was still fighting to prove he still was. The strange thing is that Brando did not want the part much more than Sinatra wanted him to have it. He knew he could not sing, knew a musical was the last place a serious young actor ought to be caught, and he took the role in the end, for reasons that had little to do with love of the material, a large paycheck among them, and the pull of a dare he was not sure he could meet. The director had to work on him, coax him, promise him it could be done. So the role that meant everything to Sinatra, the role built on the one gift Sinatra had bled to perfect, went to a man who accepted it half reluctantly, as a challenge and a payday, and who would spend the shoot quietly miserable at the thing he could not do. Had Sinatra known how little Brando prized the prize, it would not have cooled him. It would have poured gasoline on the fire. To lose the thing you love most to someone who does not even want it is a particular kind of insult, and some part of Sinatra surely felt it. The billing said it all before a single frame was shot. Brando's name would go first, above the title, top of the marquee, because Brando was the draw and everyone knew it. He was paid a small fortune for a few months' work, and he had never sung a note. Sinatra, the man whose whole life was built on song, would take second position on a musical, behind a man who could not carry a tune, and be grateful for the exposure. For most actors, billing is a matter of vanity and contract. For a man who had spent his childhood being told, without words, that he was not quite enough, the order of two names on a poster was a public ruling on exactly that question, and the ruling had gone against him. In the one arena where he should have been untouchable, he signed anyway. He needed the picture, but a man does not forget a verdict like that. He recites it to himself in the dark. And then came the second half of the insult, the part that turned a disappointment into a wound. Goldwyn still wanted Sinatra in the picture, because 2 Oscar winners on one poster was a producer's dream, and Sinatra, who needed the visibility and could not quite walk away from a hit in the making, agreed to take the other lead, Nathan Detroit. Nathan is the little schemer who runs the illegal floating crap game and spends the whole show dodging his long-suffering fiancée and scrambling for a place to hold his game. He is funny and human and endearing. He is also, crucially, not really the singer. His songs are comic patter, character numbers, the kind of thing a good actor can put across without a great instrument. The gambler with the glorious voice went to the man with no voice. The great voice went to the man with the comic asides. If you had set out to design a humiliation aimed exactly at Frank Sinatra's oldest fear, you could not have done it better. The director made it worse without meaning to. Joseph Mankiewicz, a brilliant, cultured, sharp-tongued filmmaker who had just guided Brando through Julius Caesar and would later make Cleopatra, did not want Sinatra as Nathan Detroit at all. He had wanted Sam Levy, the actor who had originated the part on Broadway, a rumpled, husky-voiced, unmistakably New York presence who was Nathan Detroit down to the bone. Mankiewicz thought Sinatra was wrong for the role, too smooth, too handsome, too much the crooner, and he was not shy about the opinion. He would say later in his cutting way that Sinatra was miscast, that the part called for a certain roughness Sinatra could not or would not supply. Sinatra was walking onto a set where the director had wanted somebody else, and the leading man had taken the role he coveted. He knew all of it. A man who reads rooms for a living always knows. Even the songs turned against him. Loesser, the composer, wrote a new number for the film called Adelaide to give Nathan a little more to do, and then watched Sinatra do the last thing a character man is supposed to do. Sinatra sang it beautifully. He smoothed Nathan Detroit out into a sleek, Italian-flavored charmer, a crooner in a loud suit, and he refused to rough up his gorgeous voice to match the Bronx-accented, untrained sound the part really wanted. Loesser, who had built the show around Sam Levine's husky, comic, unlovely delivery, was unhappy with what Sinatra did to his song, and reportedly could barely stand to watch the finished film. Here was the deepest irony of the whole production, and it says everything about the trap Sinatra was in. He could not stop being the greatest singer in the room, even when the role demanded that he try. His gift, the one thing that had ever made him feel safe, was actively wrong for the part he had been handed as a consolation prize. While his gift was exactly what the part across the hall required, the part they had given to a man who did not have it. He was too good to play small and had been denied the chance to play big. Every day on that set was a reminder. There was one corner of the picture where a little warmth got through, and it is worth pausing on because it shows what Sinatra could still do when the war paused for an hour. His scenes with Vivian Blaine, who played Adelaide, the long-suffering nightclub singer who has waited 14 years for Nathan to finally marry her, have a real and easy charm. In their sparring, the weary back and forth of a couple who cannot live together and cannot quite part, Sinatra is light and funny and human. The sly Hoboken quickness turned to comedy instead of rage. Frank Loesser, who had written the show for a rougher, more nasal kind of Nathan, and never quite forgave Sinatra for smoothing the character out, might have grumbled at the reading of it, but audiences loved it and love it still, even in the dead center of a Cold War with the man across the soundstage. The professional in Sinatra kept clocking in and doing the work, and the work was good. So when Sinatra arrived at the Goldwyn Studios to begin work on Guys and Dolls, he was not a difficult star having a bad week. He was a man freshly returned from the dead, still tasting the floor, watching the younger star who had taken his Hoboken role and his singing role stroll onto the same lot to sing badly the song Sinatra had been born to sing. The powder was dry. It only wanted a match. The match arrived on the very first day. Imagine the room on that first day of rehearsals. A big soundstage, the crew moving equipment, the two most talked about actors in America, circling each other for the first time. Brando, for all his fearsome reputation, was genuinely nervous. He had never done a musical, could not sing, dreaded the whole thing, and he did what an insecure young actor does when he is out of his depth around a master. He reached out. He went to Sinatra quietly, one professional to another, and suggested that maybe the two of them could get together in his dressing room and run their lines, work through the scenes, help each other find the rhythm of it. It was, if you strip away everything that came after, a humble and even sweet request. The kid was scared, and he was asking the veteran for help. Sinatra shut the door in his face, not gently. His reply became one of the most quoted lines in the history of Hollywood feuds. "Don't give me any of that actor's studio shit," he told him, or words close to it. The exact phrasing softened or sharpened, depending on who repeated it. It was a small sentence, and it did a great deal of work. It refused the collaboration. It mocked the whole school of acting Brando represented, and underneath the contempt, if you listen, you can hear the fear. Sinatra was not going to sit in a room and let Marlon Brando teach him about acting, because acting was the territory where Brando was the acknowledged god, and Sinatra was the singer who had gotten lucky with a doomed little soldier. He would not enter that room. He would not risk being the student, so he made it about Brando's pretension instead of his own terror, which is what proud, frightened people have always done. It is worth standing for a moment in Brando's shoes, because the story is only honest if both men get to be human inside it. Brando was not swaggering onto that set to torment Sinatra. He was frightened. He had taken a role he was not equipped for, in a form he did not understand, and he knew it, and the knowing gnawed at him. He could not sing. He could not really move to music. He was about to spend months being carried through a musical by voice coaches and film editors, exposed at the one thing he could not fake, and he had reached out to the single man on that lot who could have made it easier, the finest singer alive, in a small gesture that took real humility to make. And that man had shut the door and called his life's work a load of garbage. The wound Brando carried was not the same as Sinatra's, but it was a wound all the same, and it grew from the same soil. A childhood spent needing a love that could not be counted on. Sinatra's mother had been too present, a force that pushed and shamed. Brando's had been too absent, a warmth that kept dissolving into drink and leaving the boy alone in the house, listening for her step on the stairs. Both had grown up performing for approval and terrified of being found wanting, and here they were on the same soundstage, each one pressing, without knowing it, on the other's oldest bruise. Brando's coldness, his mumbling retreat into himself, was the armor of a boy who had learned that reaching out got you hurt. Sinatra's fury was the armor of a boy who had learned to strike first. They were two frightened children in the bodies of two of the most powerful men in America, and neither could recognize in the other the mirror he was staring straight into. From there it curdled fast, Sinatra took to calling Brando by a nickname that stuck, Mumbles, a jab at the low, searching, half-swallowed way Brando delivered his lines, and by extension at the whole, mumbling revolution he stood for. He called him, to anyone who would listen, the world's most overrated actor, and every word of it carried a double meaning, because the thing Sinatra was mocking, that mumbling, unpolished, deliberately imperfect delivery, was the exact opposite of everything Sinatra prized. Sinatra worshipped clarity. He worshipped the perfectly placed word, the lyric hit clean, the phrase that arrived whole and true the first time. To him, Brando's mumbling was not art. It was sloppiness dressed up as depth, laziness that the critics had decided to call genius. And the fact that the critics did call it genius, that the whole culture was turning toward Brando's way and away from Sinatra's, made the mockery a kind of self-defense. If he could make Brando small, he could make the future small, and hold his own world together a little longer. Brando, for his part, did not take it lying down, though his return fire came slower and drier. He would say in later years that Frank was the kind of guy who, when he died and went to heaven, would give God a hard time for making him bald, a line so perfectly aimed that it has outlived almost everything else either man said about the other. In one stroke it named Sinatra's vanity, his temper, and his refusal to accept anything he did not like, even from the Almighty. It is a genuinely funny line, and it is also a precise one. And Sinatra's baldness was a real and tender vanity, hidden under the hats and the famous toupees. Brando had found the soft spot and pressed it. These were not two men trading insults at random. They were two men who had each located the other's deepest wound and decided to lean on it. But the real war between them was not fought in nicknames. It was fought in the way they worked, and the way they worked came from the way they lived. And the two were as opposite as two crafts can be. Sinatra treated a scene the way he treated a song. He wanted it fresh, alive, caught in one perfect pass while the feeling was still new. He hated repetition. He believed, and he said so plainly, that something died a little with each take, that the magic lived in spontaneity, and that grinding a scene over and over drained the life right out of it. "Give me the first take," he would say. "That is where the truth is." He came in knowing his lines cold, rarely flubbed a word, and wanted to shoot it and move on. "One take Charlie," the crews called him, half in admiration and half in exasperation, because his impatience could be a tyranny of its own. Brando was the exact reverse. To Brando, a scene was not a thing you nailed. It was a thing you excavated. He would run it many times, changing it, feeling for something underneath the words, altering the dialogue, searching for a truer reading, treating every take as another dig into the character. 9 takes in, he was just getting warm, where Sinatra believed the truth arrived first and fled with repetition. Brando believed the truth had to be uncovered slowly, take after take, until the surface fell away and something real came up out of the ground. Neither man was wrong about acting. Both approaches have produced masterpieces, but you could not run both on the same set, in the same scene, between the same two men, without one of them going quietly out of his mind. And the two of them were about to be locked into a scene that turned that difference into a weapon. For the crew, the two philosophies were not an abstraction. They were a daily arithmetic of exhaustion and money. Sinatra came in prepared, hit his marks, gave you a clean take or two and wanted to go home. And to the electricians and camera operators and assistants who worked 12-hour days, that was not laziness, it was courtesy, a star who respected their time. Brando, chasing the truth of a moment through take after take after take, could keep a whole soundstage of people standing in the heat until midnight, while he searched for something only he could feel. And every one of those takes cost the studio real money and cost the crew real hours of their own lives. Both ways could produce greatness. Neither could share a set with the other without friction. And the crew, caught in the middle, learned to brace themselves for the long days. Whenever the two leads had a scene to play, the war was not only between the stars. It rolled downhill onto everyone, who had to light it and shoot it and wait it out. The scene was set in a place called Mindy's, a Broadway delicatessen, early in the picture, where Nathan Detroit and Sky Masterson sit across a table and needle each other over a bet. The wager is a small, funny thing. An argument over whether Mindy sells more cheesecake or more strudel. The kind of nonsense two gamblers bet on because they will bet on anything. And because Nathan is sitting at a deli table, the scene calls for him to eat. Sinatra, playing Nathan, had to work his way through a slice of cheesecake while the two men traded lines. There was just one problem, and it was the sort of small human detail that turns into legend. Frank Sinatra could not stand cheesecake. Here the accounts diverge a little, and honesty requires saying so, because this is a story that has grown in the retelling, and the exact shape of it is hard to pin down. Some versions say Brando knew perfectly well that Sinatra hated the dessert and used it as a weapon. Others say Brando simply worked the way Brando always worked, needing take after take, and that the cheesecake was collateral damage of the method rather than a targeted strike. What almost every version agrees on is the mechanism, and the mechanism is beautiful in its cruelty. Every time a take was ruined, they had to reset, and every reset meant Nathan Detroit was eating again, which meant Frank Sinatra was eating again. Slice after slice of the one food he could not swallow, take after take, because the man across the table kept blowing the ending, because that is what Brando did. He would play the whole scene beautifully, every beat true, right up to the last line, and then on that last line he would fumble it, mumbles it, get a word wrong, just enough to kill the take and force them back to the top. And back to the top meant a fresh plate, or another few bites of the same one. And Sinatra, who wanted this scene shot clean in one pass and gone, found himself trapped in exactly the kind of grinding repetition he despised, eating exactly the food he hated, at the pace of exactly the actor he could not stand. Whether by design or by temperament, Brando had built, without a single raised voice, the perfect prison for Frank Sinatra. Slow, endless, and covered in cheesecake. You can picture the afternoon wearing on. The first few takes, fine, professional. Sinatra taking his bites with the discipline of a man who hits his mark. Then the fourth, the fifth, the discipline starting to fray. The smile a little tighter each time the slate came down. By the sixth or seventh, his stomach was turning. By the eighth or the ninth, the exact number lost to the fog of set lore. The great Frank Sinatra, Oscar winner, chairman of nothing yet, but already a man who did not suffer being handled, had reached the end of his rope. And Frank Sinatra at the end of his rope was not a quiet event. He blew, he threw the plate down, he drove his fork into the table, a small violent flag planted in the wood, and he turned on his director, on Joseph Mankiewicz, and let fly. These New York actors, he shouted, in words that have come down to us in a few different colorful versions. How much cheesecake do you think I can eat? It was not really a question about dessert. It was a man who had eaten every kind of humiliation the business could serve him. The lost roles, the lost voice, the lost years, the consolation part, the director who wanted somebody else, the mumbling kid across the table who had taken everything, and who had finally been handed one slice too many. The cheesecake was just the thing his hand happened to be holding when the whole weight of it came down. They lost the rest of the day. The scene got shot the next morning, clean, in almost no time at all, which only proved the point. The problem had never been the scene. The story has grown in the 70 years since, the way set legends always do, and it is only right to say so plainly. Some later tellings pile on the numbers, until Sinatra is choking down 40 ounces of the stuff, or a whole cake, or ends up in a hospital, and the count of takes climbs with every retelling. The careful account stays smaller and more human. No crew member left a diary that afternoon, quoting the exact words, and the precise number of takes and the exact shape of the shout shift from one book to the next. What holds steady across every version, the part that has the ring of truth, because it fits both men so exactly, is the machinery of it. Brando's method turned the scene into a marathon. Sinatra's stomach turned it into torture, and the marathon and the torture met in a plate of cheesecake until a proud man could not take another bite. The details blur, the meaning does not. That afternoon became the emblem of the whole production, but it was only the loudest note. In a long, cold piece of music, the set had split into camps, the way sets do, when the two people at the top cannot be in a room together. Mankiewicz, cultured and quick and firmly on the side of serious acting, sided with Brando, as did the lovely Gene Simmons, who was playing the missionary Sarah Brown, and who had her own quiet warmth for the director. Sinatra had his people, the loyal circle that traveled with him everywhere, the ones who laughed at his jokes and lit his cigarettes, and formed a wall between him and a world he never fully trusted. Between the two, camps of frost settled in. The director found himself spending his days not directing so much as refereeing, letting each star come to him privately, to complain about the other rather than have them speak directly, carrying messages back and forth like a diplomat between two countries that had recalled their ambassadors. Because that is what it came to. The two greatest performers on the biggest musical in Hollywood, sharing a picture, eventually stopped speaking to each other directly at all. They communicated through intermediaries, through the director, through assistants, through the careful choreography of a set built to keep them apart. A supporting actor on the film, Regis Toomey, remembered it plainly years later, calling Sinatra snotty and very difficult, and saying that poor Mankiewicz had an awfully hard time on that picture. It was not a happy set. It was a demilitarized zone with a full orchestra. Spare a thought for Joseph Mankiewicz, the man caught in the middle. He was one of the finest filmmakers of his generation, a writer of glittering scripts and a great director of actors, and he had signed on to make a big, beautiful musical. And instead he found himself running a nursery for two enormous, wounded talents who would not sit at the same table. He could not shoot them together without a fight, and he could not shoot the picture without them together. So he built a whole quiet grammar of avoidance, staging around their coldness, keeping the messages moving, absorbing each man's complaints, and translating them into something the other one could stand to hear. The supporting players felt it, caught between the camps, learning fast which dressing room to steer clear of, and which lunch table was safe. It was, by every account of the people who were there, an exhausting picture to make, the kind that ages a director a full year for every month of shooting. Think for a moment about the other people on that stage, the ones whose names do not headline the feud, but who had to make a picture inside it. Gene Simmons was cast as Sarah Brown, the prim mission Sergeant Sky Masterson falls for, which meant that the young English actress had to spend her days playing tender, escalating love scenes opposite Marlon Brando, a man drowning quietly in a musical he could not sing, tense and unhappy, and buried in his own preparation. She was lovely in the part, and she carried those scenes with a warmth that reached the audience, and she did it while the leading man beside her was fighting a private war on two fronts, one against the songs and one against the singer down the hall. Whatever she felt about the strangeness of it, she kept it to herself and did the work, which is what the good ones always do. Then there were the Broadway veterans, the people who had lived inside Guys and Dolls when it was the toast of New York, and knew every beat of it in their bones. Vivian Blaine had played Adelaide on the stage, the lovelorn nightclub singer with the perpetual cold, and she brought the role to the screen intact, funny and touching and no perfect, a piece of the original show smuggled into the movie. She had watched the part of Nathan Detroit belong to Sam Levy, had heard those songs the way Frank Loesser wrote them to be heard, and now she stood on a Hollywood soundstage, watching the whole delicate machine get retuned around the biggest voice in America and the biggest sulk. The stage people understood something the studio kept forgetting. This show had been built a certain way for a reason, and every substitution, however starry, costed a little of what had made it sing in the first place. And moving through all of it, trying to make beauty out of a Frozen set, was the choreographer Michael Kidd, one of the great dance men of his day, charged with turning gamblers and showgirls into something electric on camera. Musical numbers are the hardest thing in pictures to fake, and the easiest thing in the world to kill with a bad mood. And Kidd had to generate joy on a stage where the two leads would not look at each other. The dancers hit their marks. The crap game spun into motion. The sewer set for the big number came alive with movement. And somehow, take by take, the picture found its energy in the ensemble even as its two stars sat in their separate corners. That is the quiet miracle buried under the war stories. 100 professionals came to work every day and made a beloved musical out of a cold war. And most of what they gave it survives on the screen, warm and alive, Long after the grudge that nearly poisoned it faded into an anecdote. And yet here is the part that gets lost in all the war stories. And it is the true measure of both men. They delivered. Whatever Sinatra thought of the role and of the man across the table, he showed up knowing every line. And he gave Nathan Detroit a warmth and a comic timing that hold up on the screen to this day. He is genuinely funny in the film, light and quick, generous to Vivian Blaine as the endlessly patient Adelaide, a real and charming performance from a man who was privately seething about the whole enterprise. Brando, drowning in the songs, still reached down and found the sly, watchful ease of Sky Masterson and put it on the screen against every instinct of his own fear. Two men who could not exchange a civil word off-camera managed, once the slate came down, to make a picture that people have loved for 70 years. That is craft outrunning ego. That is discipline holding a line that feeling wanted badly to cross. The audience got the movie. The two of them kept the war. Away from the camera, the two of them arranged their days to avoid each other with the care of nations drawing a border. Sinatra moved through the lot inside his circle, the loyal friends and hangers-on who traveled with him like weather, laughing at his lines, carrying his messages, keeping the world at the arm's length he preferred. Brando kept to himself, brooding, private, alone with the coaching and the dread. When they needed something from each other, word went through the director, or through an assistant, or through the strange telepathy of a crew that has learned to keep two powder kegs in separate rooms. They ate apart. They rehearsed apart when they could. A visitor to the set who did not know the story might have watched a whole day go by and never guessed that the two biggest names in American film were working 100 feet from each other because they had built, out of pure will and mutual dislike, the art of never quite being in the same place at the same time. It is a peculiar kind of discipline, that keeping a war cold on a set that hot. It cost them both something to maintain it, and neither would be the one to let it drop. Sinatra fought the picture in smaller ways too, ways that had nothing to do with Brando and everything to do with the kind of star he had become. He would not take direction on his own, numbers the way the songwriters wanted. Loesser had written Nathan Detroit as a husky, comic, working-class voice, and he wanted Sinatra to sing the character's songs, Adelaide and the Pleading, Funny Sue Me, in that rough, put-upon Bronx register. Sinatra would not do it. He sang them as Sinatra, gorgeous and smooth and controlled, because being gorgeous and smooth and controlled was the whole of who he was, the identity he had bled for. He could not make himself sound less than he was, not even to serve a character, not even when the great Frank Loesser asked him to. Loesser fumed. It was the same trap closing again from a different angle. Sinatra's gift kept overflowing the small vessel they had given him to pour it into. And Brando, from the other camp, was making his own complaint to the director about the exact same overflow. He went to Mankiewicz at one point and argued that Sinatra's romantic, beautiful singing was a problem for the film because the picture was only supposed to have one romantic lead, Sky, and here was Nathan crooning like a matinee idol and confusing the whole balance. Rein him in, Brando was in effect saying, "This is my romance to sing." Mankiewicz refused, and Brando, who did not forgive easily either, reportedly decided then and there that he would never work with Mankiewicz again, and never did. Everyone on that picture, it seemed, was busy nursing a grievance and vowing never to do this again with somebody. It was that kind of set. What almost gets lost in all the talk of Sinatra's temper is that Brando was miserable too, and for the most human of reasons. He was drowning. The musical demands terrified him, and they should have, because he genuinely could not sing, and no amount of coaching was going to change that. He worked with voice teachers, and with the choreographer Michael Kidd, he sweated over it, and he still described the sound that came out of him as the mating call of a yak, which is both very funny and very sad. The self-mockery of a proud man who knows he is in over his head. His big numbers had to be assembled in the editing room out of dozens of separate takes, a syllable here, a phrase there, spliced together so tightly that he later claimed he nearly suffocated trying to match his own patched-together track on camera, holding notes he could not actually hold. By the time they got to Luck Be a Lady, the very song Sinatra would have killed for, and would later sing 1,000 times in triumph. Brando's confidence had collapsed so badly that he tried to get out of singing it at all. He could not. The song was Sky's and Sky was Brando's, whether he could sing it or not. Picture him at the microphone on the scoring stage. This man who a year earlier had held audiences breathless with a whispered line in a taxi, now sweating over a melody he could not hold, running the number again and again, while the technicians captured a usable note here and a clean phrase there. The whole performance, destined to be assembled later out of fragments like a mosaic of a voice. He hated it. He said the tight editing left him gasping, forced to mouth on camera a track built from takes he could barely reproduce, holding notes his lungs and his ear could not honestly reach. And the number he was suffering through was Luck Be a Lady, the gambler's soaring plea to fortune, the very song Frank Sinatra had been denied and would spend the next 30 years turning into gold on 1,000 stages. One man was being tortured by the song. The other would have given a year of his life to sing it. And the song had gone to the one being tortured. If you wanted a single image to hold the whole strange injustice of that production, it was Marlon Brando, alone at a microphone, drowning in the most beautiful gift he did not want. Sit with that picture for a moment, because it is the whole tragedy folded into one image. On one side of the lot, a man who could not sing was being carried through the greatest singing role of the year, on the shoulders of 100 film editors, hating every second of it, wishing he were anywhere else. On the other side, the finest singer in the world was refusing to sing badly on purpose for a comic part he had never wanted, watching the role of a lifetime go to a man who did not even want it and could not do it. Two men, each in possession of the thing the other one needed, each two locked into who he was to hand it over, both of them furious, both of them right about the other and blind about themselves. Sinatra later summed up his own half of it to a reporter with unusual honesty, saying that Nathan Detroit was the only role that ever disappointed him, that he had wanted to play Masterson, and that Masterson did not fit Brando and Brando knew it. There was the real grievance said out loud. It fit me. He knew it did not fit him, and he took it anyway. Past this point, the story leaves the solid ground of the well-documented and drifts into the marshland of rumor, and it is only fair to slow down and mark where the firm footing ends. The verified feud is bad enough, but the legend went further, and some of the darker tales that cling to guys and dolls have never been proven, and probably never can be, and deserve to be told with the doubt attached. There is a story, for instance, that Ava Gardner, Sinatra's wife, then estranged from him, in one of the many bitter separations of that stormy marriage, was seen visiting Brando's dressing room on the lot, and that the very idea of it, whether or not anything happened, poured gasoline on a fire that was already burning. It is the kind of detail that feels almost too neat. The beautiful, unmanageable wife wandering toward the very rival her husband cannot bear. It may be true, it is often repeated, it rests on thin evidence. And then there is the darkest tale of all, the one that gets whispered whenever the feud comes up, and it should be handled with tongs. According to Brando's close friend Carlo Fiore, who told the story years afterward, and whose account reached a wider public through later, less careful biographies, Brando claimed that one night during this period, he was riding his motorcycle when he was ambushed, forced off the road, and into a car by several men, threatened with death, threatened with worse, with mutilation, with the ruin of that famous face, and then released, badly shaken. Fiore came to believe that Sinatra was behind it, given the singer's famous temper, and his long, murky, much-discussed associations with men who did that sort of thing for a living. Brando, the story goes, hired a bodyguard afterward and gave Sinatra a wide berth. It is a chilling story. It is also, by any fair standard of evidence, unproven, uncorroborated, and quite possibly untrue. Brando himself never publicly accused Sinatra of anything of the kind. No police report, no witness, no hard proof has ever surfaced. It comes down to us through a friend, decades on, filtered through books that were selling scandal by the pound. What is true, and what gave the rumor its long life, is that Sinatra really did keep company across his career with figures whose names filled FBI files, and that his temper really could be frightening, and that people around the production genuinely feared the hostility might one day turn from words to something worse. The fear was real. The event may never have happened. Both things can be true at once, and in the fog of a great feud, they usually are. What matters is not whether three men once dragged Marlon Brando off his motorcycle. What matters is that people who knew Frank Sinatra could believe, without much trouble, that he might have arranged it. That belief is its own kind of verdict on the man, and on the fear he could inspire. And it is the last dark thing the set of guys and dolls left behind. To understand why that rumor found such fertile ground, you have to understand the shadow Sinatra walked in for most of his adult life. A shadow he never fully escaped and never fully explained. From his earliest days, he had known men whose names turned up in the wrong kind of newspaper story, and he did not hide the friendships the way a more careful man might have. He had been photographed in Havana in the late 1940s in the company of Lucky Luciano, the exiled mob boss, and no amount of denial ever quite scrubbed the image away. He held interests in casinos, in the sands in Las Vegas among them, businesses that in those years were rarely more than a handshake from organized crime. The FBI kept a file on him that ran to hundreds and hundreds of pages, tracking his associations for decades, and though it never produced a charge against him, it never closed either. He gave money to good causes and comfort to men the law was chasing, and he seemed to feel no contradiction in it. Because in Hoboken, the men with power were often the men outside the law, and a boy who grew up watching that does not always draw the neat lines the rest of us are taught to draw. None of that proves he ever had a hand raised against Marlon Brando, and there is no reason to believe he did. But it is why the story could be told at all. When a man keeps that company and carries that temper, the people around him stop asking whether he is capable of something and start asking only whether he would bother. That was the atmosphere of fear he moved through, half earned and half invented by a public that loved to imagine it. He was a great artist and a generous friend, and to a certain kind of person, a genuinely frightening one, all at the same time, and he never seemed to mind which of the three you believed. The fear was useful. The fear kept people from pushing him toward the edge, which was the one thing he could not survive twice. None of this is the whole of him, and it would be a poor accounting to leave it there, because the same man who could freeze a room and carry a grudge for 40 years was also, by the testimony of nearly everyone who knew him, staggeringly generous. He paid the medical bills of friends who could not, and did it quietly, and got angry if they thanked him. He picked up strangers' burdens, funded causes he never took credit for, stood by people the town had thrown away, and gave with a lavishness that matched his rages beat for beat. The temper and the tenderness came from the same root, the childhood of a boy who never knew which mother was coming through the door, and who grew into a man of violent loyalties, warm one moment and arctic the next, capable of the deepest kindness and the coldest cruelty, sometimes toward the same person in the same week. That is the man who hated Brando, not a simple bully, a large, wounded, contradictory soul who loved hard and hated hard because he had learned, in a Hoboken flat, that feeling was the only currency that had ever bought him anything. He spent it recklessly his whole life, on the people he adored and on the ones he could not forgive. And Marlon Brando had the misfortune to fall firmly in the second column. Here is the part that must have galled Sinatra most of all. The picture worked. For all the poison behind the camera, Guys and Dolls came out in the winter of 1955, a big, colorful, stylized hit, a commercial success that made Goldwyn's million-dollar gamble pay off. The thing that saved it, ironically, was the very coldness between its stars. Sinatra and Brando share only a handful of scenes in the whole film, 3 or so, and that separation, forced by the story and lucky for the production, meant the two men rarely had to stand close enough to combust. Each did his part well within the strange, cartoon-bright world Mankiewicz built. Brando got through the songs on splices and nerve. Sinatra was charming and funny, and yes, too smooth as Nathan Detroit, exactly as everyone had warned. The audience, who knew nothing of the war, saw a bright musical and went home humming. The wound stayed inside the people who made it. Time has been kind to the picture, and, in its roundabout way, kind to Sinatra's judgment of it. Guys and Dolls is remembered now with real affection. A bright, stylized, strange, entertaining thing that has held its audience for 7 decades. And much of the affection flows towards Sinatra's Nathan Detroit, the very performance the purists once frowned at for being too smooth. Audiences did not want a husky, unlovely Nathan. They wanted the charm, and Sinatra gave them charm, and they have loved him for it ever since. But the deeper verdict, the one about Sky, has come down almost entirely on Sinatra's side. Watch the film today, and the truth is plain. Brando is a fascinating actor doing his honest best in a form that was never his, and you can feel him straining, and you can hear the seams in the singing, however cleverly they were hidden. Sky Masterson needed a voice, and the voice was standing right there in the other role the whole time. Sinatra had been right on the first day, and right on the last. The part was his by every measure that mattered. And history, which is slower than a grudge but more reliable, eventually agreed with him. He just did not get to enjoy the agreement. He was too busy carrying the grievance to notice that he had won the argument. Only once, years later, did he come anywhere near admitting it out loud. He told a magazine that Nathan Detroit was the single role in his whole long career that had disappointed him, that Masterson had never quite fit the man who ended up playing him, and that the man who ended up playing him had known it perfectly well. It was as close to confession as he ever came, buried in an offhand line to a reporter, the quiet admission that the part he pretended not to want had been the part he wanted all along, and that losing it had lodged somewhere in him that never fully closed. Then he moved on and did not say it again, and it did not close. The two men finished the picture and, as far as the record shows, never worked together again, never made peace, never had the reconciliation scene that the movies themselves would have insisted on. They simply went their separate ways and carried it, but they carried it differently, and the difference tells you something about each of them. Brando, when he bothered to address it at all, waved it off. Years later, in a long magazine interview, asked about Sinatra supposedly calling him the world's most overrated actor, Brando shrugged the whole thing away with a comedian's timing. "Were you there?" he said in effect, when Frank said it. "If a man does not say a thing to your face, it does not really count, and even if he did say it, it would not break my stride." He framed the endless press fascination with the feud as exactly that, press fascination, sensationalism cooked up to sell magazines, beneath the notice of a serious man with serious work to do. Whether that lofty indifference was genuine or was its own kind of armor, it was the posture Brando chose. He would not give the grudge the dignity of his full attention. He had bigger fish and darker demons of his own. Sinatra could not manage that and would not have wanted to. He was not built to let a thing go. The same memory that stored every slight from Hoboken onward stored this one too, filed it, kept it warm. He went on regarding Brando with a low contempt he did not bother to hide, the overrated tag following the younger man for years. Where Brando could pretend the feud did not matter, Sinatra needed it to matter, because to admit it did not matter would be to admit that losing Sky Masterson had not been a real theft, and Sinatra needed it to have been a theft. He needed to be the wronged party. A man who has spent his life fearing he is not enough cannot easily concede that the better man got the part. It is much less painful to believe the part was stolen. There is a reason he needed it that way, and the reason goes all the way back to a small blonde woman with a longshoreman's mouth in a Hoboken flat. Dolly had taught him, before he could put words to it, that love was earned by being the best, and that being merely good, being ordinary, being second, was a kind of failure that could cost you everything. So to lose a role was not, for Frank Sinatra, a normal professional disappointment, the sort of thing an actor shrugs off on the way to the next part. It was a return of the old verdict. It was the world agreeing with the quiet cruelty at the bottom of his childhood, that he was not, after all, quite enough. And the only way to keep that verdict from being true was to insist it had been rigged. If Brando had stolen the part, then Sinatra had not really lost it, and the boy on Monroe Street was safe for another day. The grudge was not pettiness, it was self-defense. It was a grown man holding a door shut against a fear he had carried since the night the doctor set him aside for dead. He would hold that door his whole life, against Brando and against everyone who ever reminded him of the same thing, and the holding of it would look, from the outside, like cruelty or ego or a bad temper, when it was really just an old, frightened boy, refusing to hear the word again. For most feuds, that would be the end. The film ships the stars part. The grudge cools into an anecdote, but this one had a second act waiting almost 20 years down the road. And when it came, it reopened the old wound in the cruelest way imaginable, because it took the very shape of Sinatra's whole life and handed it, once again, to Marlon Brando. In the early 1970s, a novel by Mario Puzo, The Godfather, was becoming one of the biggest films ever made, and tucked inside it was a character named Johnny Fontaine, a singer, an Italian-American crooner with a golden voice and a fading career, and friends in the mob who lean on a stubborn Hollywood producer with a certain equine persuasion to get their boy a movie role that revives him. Earlier in the book, those same friends had won Johnny his freedom from a stubborn bandleader by, in the novel's telling, pressing a gun to the man's head until he signed the release, the very legend that had trailed Sinatra out of his own Dorsey years. Everyone in America who could read a newspaper understood exactly who Johnny Fontaine was supposed to be, the singer with mob connections, whose career had cratered and come roaring back. Thanks to one perfect film role, it was Frank Sinatra, or a poisonous, unflattering funhouse version of him, painted for millions to see. And Sinatra was furious, in a way that went past temper into something closer to grief, because the portrait touched the two things he could never joke about: the whispers about the men he knew, and the memory of the comeback he had fought so hard to earn. The rage boiled over one night at Chasen's, the famous Hollywood restaurant, when Sinatra found himself in the same room as Mario Puzo. A mutual acquaintance, not thinking, tried to introduce them. Sinatra did not shake the writer's hand. He lit into him instead, in front of the room, calling him names, questioning his character and his parentage, telling him in essence to drop dead. And Puzo, who was no small man himself, sat there and took the public lashing from a star who had every reason to feel exposed, and no intention of hiding it. It was a Hoboken street fight in a room full of white tablecloths. The boy who would not let his name be changed to Frankie Satin was not about to let another writer turn him into Johnny Fontaine and walk away smiling. But the knife had a second edge, and this is where the old ghost of Guys and Dolls came walking back into the room. The film of The Godfather needed someone to play Vito Corleone, the aging mafia patriarch at the heart of the whole story. And by some accounts, Sinatra, whatever he thought of the book, would not have minded playing the Don himself, the commanding, dangerous old lion at the center of the picture. He did not get it. The part went, after much studio resistance, to Marlon Brando, who put cotton in his cheeks and dropped his voice to a rasp, and gave one of the most celebrated performances in the history of film, and won, for the second time, the Academy Award for Best Actor. Read that sequence slowly, because it is almost too perfect and too cruel to be anything but true. A story that the whole world recognized as a mockery of Frank Sinatra was turned into the greatest film of its era, and the man crowned at the center of it, the man who won the Oscar and the immortality, was the same Marlon Brando, who had taken Terry Malley from Sinatra's own Waterfront and taken Sky Masterson from Sinatra's own Gift 20 years before, 3 times across 2 decades. The biggest roles in the biggest pictures had landed on Brando, and every one of them had a piece of Sinatra's own life buried inside it. The Hoboken fighter, the singing gambler, and now the mobbed-up crooner's dark mirror world itself. It was as if the two men were fated to keep colliding at exactly the spots where Sinatra was most tender. No wonder he could not let it go. The universe would not let him. And then Brando did the one thing almost designed to twist the knife deeper, though he surely never thought of Sinatra when he did it. When the Academy voted him a second Oscar for The Don, he did not even come to collect it. He sent a young woman in his place to decline it on his behalf, a protest over how the film industry had treated Native Americans, and the most coveted acting prize in the world was refused. Live, in front of the whole watching country. Think of how that must have looked to Frank Sinatra. He had once crawled to that same industry and begged for its smallest blessing, had all but wept the night they finally handed him a statue of his own. And here was Brando, given the biggest prize twice over, treating it like something beneath his notice, so far above the whole game that he would not even walk up to take the trophy, to a man who had bled for every scrap of approval he ever got. That indifference was its own insult. One more proof that the things Sinatra had to claw and beg for simply fell into Brando's lap, and that Brando did not even want them once they landed. And so we come to how Frank Sinatra answered it, because he did answer it, not with his fists, and not with the shadowy men of the rumors, but with the one weapon that had never failed him, the one thing Brando could never take, because Brando had never had it. He answered with his voice. He took Luck Be a Lady, Sky Masterson's song, the great number from the role he had lost, the prayer of a gambler begging fortune to hold, and he made it his, not in the film where it belonged to Brando and the film editors, on the stage, in the concert halls and the casino showrooms, and the great arenas of his long, glorious second half. Night after night, year after year, for decades, Frank Sinatra stood in a spotlight and sang Luck Be a Lady the way it was always meant to be sung, with all the swing and swagger and aching hope that Brando's patched-together track could never dream of. And the crowds roared, and it became one of the numbers people most associated with him, a signature, a showstopper, a triumph. Brando got the role, Sinatra got the song, and when you compare what Brando left behind in that movie with what Sinatra built out of that same music across 30 years of live performance, there is no longer any argument about who Sky Masterson really belonged to. Sinatra won the war the only way he could, by outliving the grievance and outsinging the man who caused it, over and over in front of the world, until the loss itself became a kind of victory. Imagine one of those nights, a showroom in Las Vegas or a great hall in New York, the lights low, the orchestra behind him, and Frank Sinatra, older now, silver at the temples, stepping to the microphone and counting off Luck Be a Lady. The horns hit, he leans into it, all swagger and swing and that impossible phrasing, riding the beat like a man who owns the room and the night and the odds themselves, and the crowd is on its feet before he reaches the last chorus. There is no cotton in anyone's cheek, no editor stitching the notes together in a back room, no coach off in the wings praying the star can hold the line. There is just the voice, the real one, doing the thing it was born to do, to the very song it had been denied. He never introduced it as an act of revenge. He did not have to. Every soul in that room who knew the story could feel the score being settled, one glorious chorus at a time, and the ones who did not know the story simply heard the best there ever was, singing a song that had finally, after all those years, come home to the only man who could really sing it, to see what the grudge was really about. You have to lift your eyes above the two men for a moment and look at the ground they were standing on, because it was shifting under both of them, and only one of them fully understood what that meant. Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando were not just two temperaments who happened to grate on each other. They were two ages of Hollywood forced to share a soundstage at the exact hinge between them. Sinatra was the last and greatest flower of one age. Brando was the first terrifying bloom of the next. Sinatra's world was the world of craft as discipline, of the professional who showed up prepared, hit his mark, delivered clean, and made the impossible look easy because he had done the invisible work beforehand. It was the ethic of the great bands and the studio contract, where you were paid to be reliable and brilliant on schedule, where sentiment was allowed but self-indulgence was not, where a man swallowed his feelings and gave you the performance. That world had made Sinatra, and Sinatra had perfected it. When he refused a 10th take, he was not just being difficult, he was defending an entire philosophy of how good work gets made, the belief that talent honed in private should arrive in public already finished, that you did not make the audience watch you search. Brando's world was the opposite gospel, and it was winning. It said the search was the art. It said that the polished, prepared, reliable performance was a beautiful lie, and that truth only came when an actor was willing to be lost, to fumble, to be ugly, to discover the moment live, and let the audience watch him find it. It was a young man's faith, a post-war faith suspicious of glamour, hungry for something raw and real, and it was about to take over American acting for the next half-century. Every young actor who mattered would come out of Brando's shadow. Montgomery Clift had opened the door a crack, and James Dean would walk through it, and become a legend in a year and a half. And behind them came a whole army, the Newmans and the Pacinos and the De Niros, generations of actors who would build their craft on the foundation Brando laid, mumbling, searching, refusing to be slick, treating a performance as an excavation rather than a display. It was not a passing fashion. It was the new law of the land, and it would rule American acting for the rest of the century. Sinatra was not fighting a single upstart on a single picture. He was standing on the beach shouting at a tide, and some part of him knew it. And that knowledge is the acid that gave his contempt its particular sting. The old way, Sinatra's way, would come to look, to the critics and the film schools, like a relic. And Sinatra knew it. That was the true sting under the nickname Mumbles. He was not just mocking one man's diction. He was mocking a future that had already decided he was the past. And he was doing it from the deck of a ship he could feel beginning to list. Here is the turn that makes the whole thing bearable, the twist that Sinatra himself may never have fully appreciated even as he lived it. The old-fashioned man did not sink. He built one of the greatest second acts in the history of American art, and he did it precisely by being everything Brando's revolution said was obsolete. In the years right after Guys and Dolls, Sinatra signed with Capitol Records and made a run of albums with arrangers like Nelson Riddle that are still 70 years on, the high-water mark of American popular singing. The saloon albums, the swinging albums, the ones you put on at midnight and the ones you put on at a party, all of it built on the exact qualities Brando's world sneered at. Control, polish, phrasing honed to perfection, feeling delivered with total command instead of fumbled toward in the dark. He gathered his friends and built the Rat Pack and owned Las Vegas, the chairman of the board, the ring-a-ding king of a nightlife. That felt like the last glamorous stand of an older, smokier, more elegant America. He was tender on the ballads and merciless on the swingers, and he never once mumbled. And where Brando's naturalism was a style that would date, that would be copied and diluted and eventually parodied, Sinatra's record simply refused to age, because perfect phrasing does not go out of fashion any more than a perfect building does. The man who was supposed to be the past turned out to be the more permanent of the two. His way of doing things, condemned as old-fashioned in 1955, is now studied as the summit of the craft. The revolution that threatened him rolled right over Hollywood and left his records standing untouched on the far side. To understand why those records lasted, you have to picture how they were made, because the how is the whole argument. A Capitol session in those years was not a place you fixed things. It was a place you proved you did not need to. The orchestra would be assembled on the floor of the studio, 30 or 40 of the best musicians in Los Angeles, men who could read anything put in front of them, and Riddle would have the arrangements ready, and Sinatra would come in having lived with the songs for weeks, knowing every breath before he took it. There was no splicing a word in from another take. There was no building a voice out of scraps. He stood at the microphone with the whole orchestra playing live behind him, and he sang the thing through, top to bottom, and if it was not right, they did it again, all of them together until it was. He carried the room, a single man, breathing the way a dead trombonist had taught him to breathe on a bus 20 years before, holding a phrase across 4 bars, while 40 professionals followed the line of it, and getting it, more often than not, in a take or two. In those years, he did more than survive. He remade popular singing itself. Working with the arranger Nelson Riddle, he built long-playing records that hung together as single unbroken moods from the first track to the last. One album, a small hour's meditation on loneliness and lost love. Another, a bright finger-snapping celebration of being alive. The whole emotional weather of a grown man, laid out in order across 2 sides of a disc. He more or less invented the modern album as a form of art while he was at it. And he did it in his late 30s and 40s, the age when the town had already written him off once. The boy they said was finished came back and quietly changed the thing he did forever. Think of what that meant. Set against a soundstage where engineers had once bent over a strip of tape, stitching a leading man's voice together syllable by syllable, because the man could not carry a tune. The 2 scenes are the same art turned inside out. In one room, the illusion of singing was manufactured after the fact out of borrowed pieces. In the other, the real thing was delivered whole, in the moment, by a man who had made himself into an instrument through nothing but want and work and terror of being sent back to Hoboken. Sinatra had been handed the wrong room in 1955. He spent the rest of his life proving which room the music actually lived in. He never said it that plainly. He did not have to. The album said it for him, and they are saying it still. Sinatra never had the words for that vindication, and maybe never let himself believe in it, because a reprieved man does not trust good news. But it was there quietly the whole time. Every night he stood up and sang "Luck Be a Lady Better Than Sky." Masterson was ever sung on film. He was proving, without knowing he was proving it, that the old craft had outlasted the new fashion. The grudge told him he had lost. The music told him he had won. He listened to the grudge. He almost always listened to the grudge. You could see the same wound reopen in other rooms, with other people, all through his life, because the grudge against Brando was not a single flaw, but the shape of the whole man. He fell hard for John Kennedy in 1960, campaigned for him, rewrote a song for him, built a helipad at his own home for a promised presidential visit, gave the young senator his glamour and his crowds. And then, when the new administration decided that Sinatra's shadowy friendships were a liability, Kennedy stayed with Bing Crosby instead on a trip to the desert, and the helipad sat unused. And the man who had given the president everything was quietly cut loose. It gutted him. It was the same old cruelty in a new suit. The thing he was proudest to offer, his loyalty, thrown back in his face by a world that decided he was not, after all, quite the right sort. He carried that one too, of course. He carried all of them. A man who has been told once, deep down, that he is not enough, spends the rest of his life collecting the evidence. And Frank Sinatra was a diligent collector. Brando was simply the entry he underlined. There is a mercy in this story that only becomes visible from a distance, and it belongs to the man Sinatra could not stop hating. Because if you follow the two lives all the way to the end, a strange thing happens to the ledger. The man who kept winning the roles kept losing at the deeper game, and the man who kept losing the roles built the more livable life. The universe, which had seemed to favor Brando at every casting call, was keeping a longer and sadder set of books. Marlon Brando reached his second summit with The Godfather, and then, almost as if the triumph had exhausted something in him, began a long retreat that never really ended. He came to hold the very craft that had made him a god in something close to contempt, calling acting a con, a childish way to make a living, refusing to take it seriously, showing up for enormous paychecks and small effort, letting the great instrument rust, because using it seemed to cause him some private pain he would not explain. He grew heavy, then enormous. He hid himself away, most famously on a remote atoll in the South Pacific that he had bought as a refuge from the world that had worshipped and hounded him. The most magnetic screen presence of his century spent his last decades trying to disappear. And then the deeper losses came, the kind that make a stolen movie role look like nothing at all. Brando's family life fractured in ways that were genuinely tragic, private griefs that spilled into public headlines against his will. A son caught up in a killing at Brando's own home. A beloved daughter lost to despair a few years later. These were wounds no comeback could heal, and no Oscar could balance, and Brando carried them, largely in silence to the end of his life. The boy whose mother had loved him and kept vanishing into the bottle grew into a man who loved his own children and could not keep his family from coming apart. The pattern from Omaha had followed him all the way home. He died in the summer of 2004, an old man, mostly withdrawn, his genius long since put down like a tool he no longer wished to pick up. Set that beside Sinatra's ending and the whole feud tilts and shows you a different face. Yes, Sinatra was volatile and married 4 times and made enemies and carried grudges to the grave, this one among them. But he never stopped working, never stopped loving the thing he did, never came to sneer at his own gift, the way Brando came to sneer at his. To the very end, Sinatra believed in the song. He believed that standing up in front of people and singing to them was a fine and serious way to spend a life, maybe the finest. And that belief kept him upright and pointed forward long after the voice had begun to go. Brando, handed more natural genius than almost anyone, ended up ashamed of it. Sinatra, who had to build every ounce of his out of breath and want and terror, ended up in love with it. That is the quiet reversal at the heart of the story. The envied man was hollow where it mattered most, and the envious man was, in the one place that counts, whole, none of which Sinatra could see, of course. Standing on that soundstage in 1955, eating cheesecake he could not stomach, and hating the boy across the table. From where he sat, Brando had everything: the youth, the acclaim, the roles, the future itself. He could not know that the future would be so much heavier to carry than the past. He only knew that this mumbling kid from Omaha had, somehow again, walked off with a piece of his life. And he did what he had always done with pain. He kept it. He filed it. He carried it forward into the decades, warm and undimmed, all the way to his own end. The reconciliation never came. That is the plain fact at the end of it, and it is worth sitting with. Because in the movies, the two old rivals always find each other in the last reel, shake hands, admit the years were foolish, and the music swells. Real life is stingier with those scenes. Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando finished Guys and Dolls, walked off the Goldwyn lot, and simply never crossed paths in any warm way again. No dinner, no phone call, no late-life interview, where one of them softened and said the other had been a great artist after all. The people closest to Brando, decades on, still spoke of Sinatra as an enemy. The people closest to Sinatra knew that Brando was a name you did not bring up, unless you wanted to change his mood for the evening. Two men who had helped define what a movie star could be, who had won the same prizes, and moved through the same small world for half a century, kept a wall between them until death took the trouble out of their hands. And death came for them the way it comes for everyone, and it found them very differently. Sinatra went first, in the spring of 1998, in Lowe's Angels, an old man of 82, whose heart finally gave out after years of decline. He had kept singing almost to the end, long past the point where the voice could do what it once did, because the singing was not a job to him and never had been. It was the proof. It was the thing that made him enough. When the lights of the Empire State Building were turned blue in his honor, and the world stopped for a day to mourn the chairman, it was a strange and fitting tribute to a boy from a cold water flat who had spent his whole life terrified that he would be forgotten. He was not forgotten. He is still not. Brando followed 6 years later, in the summer of 2004, an old man of 80, mostly hidden away, his great gift long since set down, his life marked by griefs that no amount of fame had softened. The most magnetic actor of his century died largely out of view, heavy, private, worn down by losses that had nothing to do with any part he ever played or lost. The two of them, who could not share a soundstage in 1955, now shared the only thing left to share, the past tense. They belonged to history together, whether they liked it or not, filed side by side in the record of an age that had made them both, and pitted them against each other, and finally outlived them both. So what was it really about? This grudge that outran 2 long lives, and refused to die even when the men who carried it did. It was never really about a musical. Guys and Dolls was only the room where the thing happened to stand up and show its face. Strip away the cheesecake and the nicknames and the whispered rumors and the 2 Oscars sitting a step apart, and what you find underneath is a much older and much simpler ache. Frank Sinatra despised Marlon Brando because Marlon Brando kept appearing at the exact places where Sinatra was most afraid. The Hoboken fighter, the singing gambler, the crooner with the shadow behind him, and kept walking off with the prize, and kept doing it with an ease that looked, to a man who had bled for everything he owned, like theft. Brando was the mirror Sinatra could not stop looking into, and the face in the mirror kept whispering the one word Dolly had planted before he could talk. Not enough, not enough, not yet. He never was going to be enough, not in the way he needed, because the hole had been cut too early and too deep for any amount of applause to fill it. That is the quiet tragedy under all the swagger. The screaming girls could not fill it. The Oscar could not fill it. The comeback, the Rat Pack, the greatest records American music has ever produced. The money, the power, the presidents who took his calls, none of it could fill it, because it was not really a hunger for any of those things. It was a hunger to hear, just once and for good, that the boy the doctor set aside for dead had been worth saving. And a hunger like that does not get satisfied. It only gets managed with work with grudges, with a wall of talent built so high that no one can climb it to say the terrible thing to your face. Brando, arriving young and gifted and adored, looked to Sinatra like a man who might get over the wall. So Sinatra hated him and kept hating him and turned the hatred into 30 years of the finest revenge ever taken, which was simply to be great out loud forever, in front of everyone, and to make the stolen song his own. There is a mercy in it too, if you look for it, and it is the kind of mercy that only shows up at the very end of a story. The song outlived the grudge. Luck Be a Lady does not belong to Marlon Brando anymore, if it ever did, and it does not belong to Sky Masterson or to Samuel Goldwyn, or to the men who spliced a voice together on a scoring stage in 1954. It belongs to the man who wanted it most and was told he could not have it, the man who took it anyway, one night at a time for 3 decades, until the whole world agreed it was his. The thing they tried to keep from him became, in the end, one of the things he is most remembered for. He lost the role and won the music, and the music is what lasts. That is not a bad ending for a boy from Hoboken who was supposed to lose everything. Go back now to where this started, a sound stage in the last cold months of 1954, a strip of tape on a bench, and a row of engineers building a voice out of scraps, because the leading man cannot really sing. Down the corridor behind a plainer door, the finest singer alive, sitting in the smaller part, eating cheesecake he cannot stomach, listening to the sound of another man, being carried through the song that should have been his. 2 doors a few feet apart, and between them the whole story, the fear and the fury, and the wound that never healed. It looked at the time like a simple thing, 2 difficult stars and a bad picture. It was never simple. It was a boy who had survived his own birth against the odds, still fighting 39 years later to prove he had been worth the saving, and a younger man who had the terrible luck to remind him, again and again, that the fight was not yet won. They are both gone now, and the studio is gone, and the era that made them is a thing you find in black and white on a quiet afternoon. But put the record on, the real one, the live one, the one where an older man leans into a microphone and dares the dice to be good to him, and the years fall away, and the argument is finally over. He got there first, he got there best, he got there last of all, singing the song they told him he could not sing, in a voice no splice could ever fake. And if you listen closely, under all the swing and all the swagger, you can still hear the boy from Hoboken, doing the only thing that ever made the fear go quiet, and doing it better than anyone who ever lived.